Pam Barcole with Community Matters, and I'm a facilitator for this, and I'm also a land use planner who has had to watch over short-term rentals in another community, which has been exciting. But I would like Mayor Linda Olson just to welcome everybody.
Sorry, getting my here. Welcome, everybody. I'm Linda Olson, representing council as mayor, and I think that Laura Valentine is here, maybe, and Rita Russell, do you want to stand? So we have two other council members here listening in tonight, ready to learn quite a bit. But I particularly want to thank this panel because these folks have some pretty important experiences for us to learn from and gather information from. And also for the planning and zoning folks for the work that you've been doing for a while on this. I know it's a complicated issue, and it's one that's upon us whether we want it or not. So we need to figure out what's the best way to approach issues of short-term rentals and what do we really want as a community and how do we want to regulate one way or the other. So appreciate your time here and the input, and this isn't the end of it. There'll be more public possibilities for you to have input. Thank you. And thank you, Barb, for facilitating. She's done a great job with this the last few times.
Okay, so the intent of tonight's meeting, I hope you all picked up an agenda, is to really learn how 3 metro area communities are addressing short-term rentals. It's Denver. We have 2 people from Denver, and we'll introduce them in a minute. We have Lakewood on the end, and then we have Englewood here. So one of the things we've asked each of the presenters to address is what are the policy lessons learned when looking at short-term rentals? How have metro area communities enforced short-term regulations, because that's becoming more and more.
We can't hear back here.
We can't hear?
Now we can.
Okay, sorry. How have metro area communities enforced short-term rentals? And then what can be done to ensure the residents of a community that short-term rentals collect the tax revenue? So with a number of these communities, one of the promises they give to the residents of the community is, like in Denver's case, I think you collect, what, 10.76% tax? 10, yeah. So they collect a lot of tax, and those taxes are then purportedly supposed to go to the residents for facilities and services. I do know that in Massachusetts now, otherwise known as Taxachusetts, they collect state taxes, local taxes, and occupancy tax, and then what they call a community impact tax. So I think that it's about 20%. And so the people that are renting on Airbnb or renting on Booking.com, which is now the first, they're higher than Airbnb now in terms of rentals. So what each of the planners are going to do, and in one case, the code enforcement person, Brian, which is great, is basically talk about the policy lessons, public education, what kind of community outreach did they do? I know in Lakewood, Aaron, you guys actually did a survey, correct?
Okay.
And they have you could look on their website, it's called Lakewood Speaks. And so it's a way in which the community interacts with the council and staff. I think it's important to look at how the taxes are levied and what they're used for. And then lastly, how you enforce the short-term rentals. Because, Brian, did you tell me? So, hosting, what is it called?
Post-compliance.
Post-compliance. Now, I dealt with post-compliance down in Manitou Springs, where we had short-term rentals, and they have these webinars. And at the webinar, for staff, so they know how it all works, they said, well, what if it's not listed on Booking.com, Airbnb, or VRBO? Well, we can't look at every little market, so it's not going to catch everything. So why don't we start, and I'm not sure, Abe, are you going to go first, or Brian?
Denver, I should probably start, just because I'll give some of the history.
Okay, so just so you know, Abe is an AICP principal planner with the city of Denver, and he led the development of design standards and density bonuses in downtown Denver. And more importantly, he participated in the drafting of the regulations. What I think is interesting about Denver's regulations, because they were sort of the leader, they enacted regulations in 2016, and they just revised those regulations, which the two of them will talk about and why that occurred. So why don't you please go ahead.
Thank you. And can you hear me all right? Great. Raise your hand if I stray too far from the mic. Yeah, I was one of the people that helped put the system together. There were a number of other people, but I was kind of the lead on the zoning side. And then Brian here has come more recently, but has much more experience with the operation of the system. Like, he's really in the trenches, whereas I've kind of stepped away. So I'll just start by telling you a little bit about how we put the system together. And so the story kind of starts in 2014, which is a little before I even worked for the city of Denver. But Councilwoman Mary Beth Sussman put together a sharing economy task force to kind of take on growing sharing economy considerations across the city. That quickly focused on short-term rentals. That was just kind of the most pressing issue at that moment. We didn't have the scooters yet and other things like that. And that became a really big effort that led to a pretty big public process to help sort out what should happen. So where we were in early 2014 when all of this started was that the term short-term rental did not exist in any of Denver's regulations. And the interpretation that we had from our attorneys was none of the allowed things that did exist could accommodate short-term rentals, basically meaning all of the short-term rentals that were happening, and there were hundreds, well, thousands really, that were already happening at that time, were illegal. And so we were trying to sort out where to go. And so it was a 2-year process of figuring this out, and we had lots of meetings with city council committees and with planning board, with neighborhood organizations. We had 2 big community open houses towards the end of the process, like one in each quadrant of the city, and hundreds of people came to these meetings. That all led up to, in June of 2016, the adoption of amendments to the Denver zoning code and to the Denver municipal code that set up the system that we have now. So basically, we allowed short-term rentals. It's the very high-level summary, but there's lots of nuance to that. Because really what we were going for coming out of that public input was a system that would recognize the growing popularity of these kinds of sharing economy options, specifically short-term rentals, while providing some balance, specifically protection for neighborhoods, individual residents within neighborhoods, short-term rental guests and hosts, as well as traditional hotels. So just a little bit more detail about how we allowed them. The first part that I led was a change to the zoning code, because first we had to say, actually this is a defined thing, a short-term rental. And so we defined it as being accessory to a primary residential use. That's kind of zoningese for, it's not the main thing happening in a dwelling unit, it's secondary. And so that's kind of crucial to the compromise we arrived at. And then the amendment to the code, basically in all of the various use tables for all the different districts throughout the city, said permitted with limitations. And so it means that everywhere where residential dwelling units are permitted in the city of Denver. Short-term rentals are permitted as accessory to that. So that's basically the whole city. There's some industrial districts where residential isn't permitted, and those are the only places where you couldn't do short-term rental, but you couldn't live there either. So the limitations in the zoning code, a number of them were about just consistency with other home-based businesses that had been permitted for decades in many cases, home-based beauty parlors and accounting firms and things like that. So we just carried forward, yes, you can have a small sign. No, you can't have regular employees. That's causing some confusion with short-term rentals, which we can get into. But those things were carried forward. And then some more specifics to clarify that, in fact, there was not a specific limit on the number of short-term rental guests that you could have, or the number of nights that you could conduct a short-term rental, and that short-term rentals could occur anywhere within the dwelling unit, and that actually includes an accessory dwelling unit where you have one. And so what that means is that if you have like the traditional granny flat, like detached accessory dwelling unit in the back, you actually can conduct short-term rentals in there. But since this is all accessory to the primary residential use of the property, you have to be the resident of the property. So basically you have to be living in the main house, doing the short-term rentals in the accessory dwelling unit, or living in the accessory dwelling unit and doing it in the main house when there's two units like that. Then we also adopted changes to the municipal code, which set up the licensing system that Brian will talk more about, which is really where the meat of the rules live. Because what we did in zoning was basically say, it's permitted, you don't even need a zoning permit. You don't have to tell the planning department that you're going to start doing this, but you do need to get a business license, and that's where Brian comes in. And there's a number of requirements related to running a business in that part of the ordinance. So leading up to June of 2016, the adoption of the system, it was not without controversy. There were a reason that there were hundreds of people at these meetings. And you know, there were a lot of people who felt that short-term rentals should not be permitted at all. They were illegal prior to the creation of this system. And they were, I think, oftentimes very upset that they heard from people at these workshops, oh, I've been conducting short-term rentals and it's great, when it actually wasn't allowed at that time. There were others kind of at the other end of the spectrum who felt that the limitations that we proposed to put on short-term rentals, specifically that it had to be accessory, that was the big one, were too onerous and would prevent some things that actually were great money-making opportunities or that people specifically had had good experiences with. There were, of course, people who had been conducting short-term rentals in investment properties throughout the city, and they wanted those to become legitimized, and this system did not do that because that would have been primary use of those properties. They were full-time short-term rentals. So there was that group. And then we had just a lot of folks who wanted to talk about things kind of in between. You know, shouldn't you be able to conduct one short-term rental even if it's not in your house? Or especially if it's right next door, and a lot of things like that. And a lot of reasonable things that, from a staff standpoint, a lot of that stuff we kind of pushed against, mostly because we couldn't figure out how we could adequately enforce a lot of things like that. So we ended up with a fairly simple system. You have to be the resident of the property. And that really helped address some of the big concerns we were hearing about affordable housing. Let's not take long-term units off the regular market, which could, you know, reduce supply and push up prices. And let's ensure that neighborhoods are still about the people that live in them and aren't entirely about full-time short-term rentals, say that, you know, the big concerns that we heard. And so I'll let Brian give his impressions, especially considering his more recent experience. But I think that for the most part, you know, my impression is that the system is operating as intended, and that the core arguments behind what we did remain true now, that things haven't changed, and fact, of course, the arguments about affordable housing have only increased. So,
Hey, before you turn it over to Brian, I want people to ask a clarifying
You hold the
question.
microphone in, please.
Don't like this mic. So my clarifying question, and others may have one, so when you define that it needs to be accessory to the primary use, do you define accessory using a percentage or a size limit, or does it just need to be a little bit smaller?
well, that's a really good question, and it's a bit artful, because we aren't so specific as to say, it's only 10% of the floor area. That probably doesn't work in the case of this. We do say that about some other home-based businesses. We don't say it's only 20 nights a year. That would be another like numerical thing. We were really worried about enforcement. We talked to a lot of other cities that had rules like that, and they just could not figure out how to enforce it. So basically what it says is it's your customary place of return is your primary residence. It's where you live. But what if you live half the year in Scottsdale and half the year in Denver? This definition doesn't tell you for sure. If you wanted to conduct a short-term rental, you'd say, I live in Denver. And that probably works as long as you can demonstrate to Brian here with a driver's license or the other things that you require that that is your primary residence. Does that help?
Yeah. Does anybody else have a clarifying question just on the zoning side, and then we'll go to the regulatory side? Carolyn?
You said that you revised them recently. How did you revise them?
So I think Brian will probably go into that in more detail. We haven't done anything with the zoning code, so the really high-level rules are all still in place. They just adopted or are just about to adopt, actually, new updated rules and regulations that just clarify how a lot of things work.
Okay. For those of you that don't have name tags, you're making it difficult. Go ahead in the black.
Quick question. So if I'm not the primary owner, say I'm 50% owner of the property with my parents, but I live in the property, my parents don't, would that be an option to split with it?
Nothing to do with ownership. So if you live there, you can conduct the short-term rental.
As long as I'm a partial owner? Or
Doesn't matter.
Oh,
You could be
okay.
renting the place. Now, for Brian, you're going to have to demonstrate that you have the landlord's permission in that case, but it is technically possible.
Okay. The woman in the,
I've had, when you mentioned 6 months here and 6 months there, I'm a little confused. Wouldn't you rather go on voter registration? Because Arizona in particular, and almost every other state, if you've lived there for 1 month, you have to get a driver's license in Arizona. And that's almost the case everywhere. So if you go there and you drive around, they'll give you a ticket if you're there for more than a month. So it's very confusing.
There are a range of things you can use to demonstrate.
So I would answer that. Prior to this, as a police officer, I don't think I'd ever seen that ticket written unless somebody said, I've lived here for 6 months, and then you might write that ticket. You would never know that.
I have lived in Tucson,
Yeah.
and my daughter lives in Tucson, and I can guarantee that that will happen to you.
Right. But if you gave them a Colorado driver's license, I'm sure they'd just write a ticket under your Colorado driver's license.
so before Brian goes on, why don't you let him talk about the regulatory side? So the interesting thing about Brian is that he, before he became the, what's your exact title?
Compliance Program Administrator.
Right.
Not a CPA.
But he's got a great skill set. So as he said, he was a policeman for many years. And he's also an attorney. So what a better person.
Great life choices.
Yes, great life choices. So Brian, I know there's some
Moving
people.
backwards.
Yes, I know there's some people in the audience that really want to know sort of how do you regulate this beast that is growing at a very fast pace.
Right. And so I kind of start off every discussion with this, going into a new town or city that's thinking about this, is the first important question that you have to ask yourself as the city is what are our values? Breckenridge has different values than Denver. Englewood probably has different values than Denver. I think we were talking earlier, you don't have any hotels. Is tourism a thing? So for Denver, when anybody speaks of Denver, and I talk about this all the time with people that are trying to get licenses, we constantly refer to neighborhoods, right? Where do you live? Rhino, Baker, Wash Park. So one of our values in making this license was to keep neighborhoods neighborhoods. And that's from my boss down is what my goal is, right? So we have embraced the sharing economy. Short-term rentals are going to be there. It's how do you regulate it and what kind of values do you want to put on that? Some lessons learned. We had never, as a department, so I work for the Department of Excise and Licenses, and we issue every type of business license for the city of Denver, from marijuana down to food peddlers. This is the first license that we've kind of technically put into somebody's house, right? So we have all these rules that we can revoke a license, we can punish a license, we can suspend a license, but 99% of them dealt with businesses and how you were conducting your business. And so what we found out pretty quickly in terms of behavior was we didn't have a lot of tools to go after a bad short-term rental operator. So in Denver, we've had plenty of places that sleep 15 to 20. They're coming in from vacation from Florida. Obviously, it's Denver. Most of them are picking Denver for a reason. Right. So you can imagine, what used to be a quiet neighborhood street now has a house that sleeps 15 to 20, and a lot of marijuana and partying. And what I always tell people is short-term rentals, when done correctly, are a great thing. When neighbors can communicate and people know what's going on and that primary residence function works, short-term rentals are great. Once somebody doesn't live in that house, for us, in our experience, it goes bad fast. You can get one house that can ruin 3 or 4 blocks, just with the amount of parking, the amount of partying, the amount of late night noise, the neighbors get together. So that was one of our values, was protecting the neighborhoods, and we do that by primary residency. Hopefully the system works that if you are living at the house, in theory you care about that house, and you care about your neighbors, and you care about the way your business is being run, because basically we've taken a commercial enterprise and put it into a neighborhood. And so there's got to be some sort of response or some sort of, responsibility to your neighbors. So our actual definition, we would close, it's the usual place of return for housing. So what we've learned with that is the usual place is subject to many definitions. And so I would say for that 6 months and 6 months, we have a fairly robust program where the director can ask for documentation. So I'll just ask for your tax returns. Where did you file your tax returns? Because that's kind of the end goal to me, right? If you spent 6 months in Scottsdale and 6 months in Denver, but you filed your federal income tax returns from Denver, that 99% of the time settles it for me. That Denver is where you consider your primary residence. So moving on to what we've done recently. And I was talking about how we didn't have a lot of rules that we could enforce in people's houses. So somebody has a late night party and the cops don't write a ticket, that doesn't really fall in the parameters of running a bad business or the rules that we have. So we recently adopted our insurance requirements, which we were required to do by ordinance. So the director set that at $1 million, and we can talk about that if you want. But we adopted a rule that we can revoke a license if it violates the health, safety, and welfare of the neighborhood. So as these things add up, as these bad operators get a number of complaints, and I can get witnesses to come in, we can have a hearing and say, this is every weekend, every Saturday night for the last 3 months. I haven't slept because they're partying until 3 or 4 in the morning. And so we can start looking at revoking licenses that way. That would be my, besides figuring out your values, what value do you want to put on this license or this permit, is do you have a disciplinary structure in place for when it goes bad, so you're not playing that catch-up game, which we've had to play a little bit. The other thing that I would say is if you go with primary residence, that you define it very well. That's been a little bit of a struggle. I'm not sure if any of you saw the case. It made a lot of the news that we revoked the license, and that was our first one. That was a lot of work. I'll tell you why I picked that house as my first case. I had 12 neighbors that were willing to testify. That's not going to happen on every case. It may be one neighbor that's having a problem. The person may not live there, and it's a semi-provable case, but I have to prove that case. So if it's going to be a primary residence thing, I would say define it, and there's a lot of ordinances out there that I can help whoever find, that a lot of cities are trying some different language, and it's getting better. Everything is getting better. Like we were talking earlier about California. California just won a major lawsuit against Airbnb and HomeAway, which is going to help us tremendously. So it's been a process. I don't know if there's any follow-up.
So I'm going to ask clarifying questions, but I have one for you to start. So first I told Brian that I know a realtor that actually has an Airbnb in North Park Hill, and she was extremely happy with the new regulations. And so Brian was saying, or maybe Gabe was saying, well, we never hear that. But what she said is that the change in the regulations made it easier for her as an owner to figure out what she had to do. So that's the good news.
Right.
So here's my question on what you do, because I run a not-for-profit called Community Matters Institute. We've been doing a lot of primary research on this. So one of the things we've discovered is that more and more municipalities all over the U.S. are adopting the owner-occupied rule. But what people are doing to get out of the owner-occupied rule is they may be living with their significant other in one house, but they list their Airbnb as their primary residence.
So
How do you handle
we've
that?
started a couple of things recently. One, in the last month, I developed an affidavit, which makes it clear. So we put on there that I state your name, live at, and you write an address, and the next paragraph says, I swear this under penalty of perjury. So that one has cut out probably 50% of the people. So now my next step is, can I prove they live somewhere else? And we are currently in the process of speaking with the Denver police about prosecuting these cases for perjury.
Okay.
It falls under the perjury statute, which is attempt to influence a public official.
And who in Denver does the code enforcement? You. And you
In
have,
this case, it's licensing.
yeah,
Yeah.
For short-term
Oh,
rentals.
excise, the Department of Excise and License.
yeah, okay, okay. Other clarifying questions?
Well, I don't know if it's clarifying. I had a question, because you had mentioned landlords. And one thing I find interesting is I would say about, I mean, the majority of leases don't allow the tenants to Airbnb. Yeah, they don't allow it. And, but yet they do it. And the majority of cities, if you're caught, the property owner is the one that gets fined.
Yes.
So even if you as the landlord watch that, and you say, okay, we're gonna non-renew or whatever, they take it down, they could put it back 4 days later. It seems that it's a situation where, why would a landlord ever turn their tenant in if they need help, if they're gonna get fined? See what I mean? It seems like an area where people could,
Right.
that those folks could work together.
Right, and I have no problem, so I'm the one that writes the administrative citation tickets, and I can dismiss them. And if I've never fined a landlord where a tenant was doing something wrong, in that situation. In my experience, so there's standard leases out there that all the landlords use, and that says you can't sublet. I think over time, just the growing nature of short-term rentals, that's going to be changed.
Yeah, a lot of them now specify.
Right. So in Denver, in order to get a license, and it's been this way for a while, this was our first online application, so we didn't do bad, we didn't do great. We are beta testing tomorrow a whole new application system. So we need an affidavit from the applicant. So if you're a tenant, you need an affidavit that says you have proof of premises. Like, we're not going to collect your lease anymore because we're tired of collecting leases. So we're going to have the landlord sign something that says he's allowed to live here. And then the next line is he's allowed to short-term rent. So.
Because I don't know if you read too that Aimco's sued Airbnb. Aimco's a large REIT, like partner.
Oh.
They sued Airbnb. Just one.
What was that?
I can find the, it's like, I'll give you my copy.
Okay. That'd be great to know.
So a couple of questions, one on the ordinance side. Since Denver, with regards to ADUs, which ties into this a little bit, has left that up to the neighborhoods to kind of decide, who's going to take ADUs and who's not. Is that how you're approaching the short-term rentals, or is it just a blanket statement for Denver proper?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We, of course, had folks saying, why don't you let each neighborhood decide whether it wants short-term rentals, basically. And probably the way that would have gone is by neighborhood demographics. Like, some of the younger neighborhoods would have said, yeah, for sure, and other neighborhoods would have really opted out. We foresaw years worth of fighting over it, basically. And so in talking to other cities, really pushed for, let's get a system that's workable and balanced and roll it out over the whole city. There's definitely always going to be certain neighborhoods that have more of them. They're just more iconic for tourists or better located or whatever. But regardless of what neighborhood it's happening in, the potential impacts are the same, and the potential benefits in terms of earning extra money to pay the rent or whatever else. And so I'm really glad we were able to just hold to the idea of, let's just get the rules right and roll it out citywide.
Okay, and that makes sense. So on the regulatory side, you mentioned that code enforcement or your department enforces all of this. In Englewood, with regards to the ADU ordinance that just passed, we've been told as citizens that code enforcement is not going to enforce ADUs, that it's up to the citizens of Englewood to enforce or monitor your neighbors. And so a big concern with regards to Airbnbs, it sounds like you guys are actually, being very proactive in putting process in place and documentation and reviewing all of that. One of the concerns that I've got with Englewood is that we won't do that. And so that becomes a big concern from my standpoint. Also with regards to signage, I've been told that Englewood has taken a neutral stance on signage due to cases that have come up specifically in Arizona with the Supreme Court. And so I'd be interested to know, how does Denver manage that? And let's just keep it to the ADUs or the short-term rental side of things. Before short-term rentals were approved, were you guys actually policing? Were you doing anything about these short-term rentals, Airbnbs, that were actually advertising as businesses on their front yard illegally?
I don't think we've done one case of advertising in a yard or on a house, and I don't think I've seen a sign. I would say in Denver, there is more motivation to keep it quieter.
So that brings up a good question. What is your stance when it comes to business signage such as Airbnb on a front yard?
Right. I've never seen a sign.
So there's a whole thing we
And
can talk
nobody's ever
about.
complained about a sign.
Okay.
So,
I'm going to let Dan ask, is that right? Let him ask a question, and then you can follow up.
No, I'm good.
Okay, because I want to keep on time, so Aaron's going to be next. So go ahead, Dan.
You mentioned that you would clearly define particularly primary residency and things like that nature. If you had a time machine, you could go back. What would be sort of the one thing, as it pertains to that definition, would be sort of what a recommendation would be possibly as far as what other cities should put in if they're looking at that? I mean, are you talking month qualifications of that? Because that's probably incredibly hard to prove as well.
I think, so at the beginning, I thought that too. And as I've gone through cases, I've backtracked on that. So if there was a number of days that was out there, so let's say you live in the house 120 days a year. My issue right now is I go to neighbors and I say, have you ever seen them? And,
Yeah.
right, so, and then it's like, oh, they were here last month, but they ran in with the cleaning crew and stocked some things up and then left. And then that one case got really interesting. I guess I'll say it. He would go over and have a sandwich sometimes and say, I used my house that day. So, didn't fly all that well. But I'm kind of back to that 120 days, because at least the neighbors could say something. Like, I've seen him 4 times, I've seen him 12 times, I've seen him 20 times. And at least we're getting closer to a standard that I could uphold, rather than kind of this notion of usual place of return for housing. So I waver on it a lot. I mean, I thought we had it right 6 months ago. I would have argued my head off that we had it right and better than any other city. I'm rethinking that now, that maybe there is a number of days or a number of days of rentals that would make it more effective.
And one of the things we can talk about after the break at 7:30, when everybody had a chance to talk, is we can also talk about what's impacted a lot of municipalities and counties, is people buying homes specifically as Airbnbs. So it's owned by a group of investors. And this also has become a really big business where investors are going in and buying property. The other thing you should all be aware of is if you have an Airbnb and you're using Airbnb, they hold seminars for you on how to be a good Airbnb host. So they give you a lot of information. Okay, Aaron's going to be next. And just so you know, Aaron, when did your short-term rental regulations go into effect?
We do not have short-term rental regulations in effect right now. It's not allowed. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Aaron has been studying this for 2 years in the Development Assistance Department as a planner in the city. Lakewood, and my understanding was that you had a licensing ordinance that just passed?
We do not. So it was going to city council. I thought I was going to come here and tell you our story of how it passed. But they actually tabled it because they want some additional information. So our journey started in late 2016. City council had directed staff to basically gather information because constituents were asking, questions. Can I do this? Why can't I do this? I want to do this. I don't like them. My neighbors do it. So they were getting both sides from their constituents saying, we want them and we don't like them. So they said, we really need some additional information. So can staff pull together some information, educate us on what short-term rentals are, how prevalent they are. As you can imagine, it's very difficult for staff to kind of go into one of these Airbnb sites or VRBO and find, how many are there. You can kind of get a snapshot and a picture, but it's very difficult to go in. And at any particular time of year, it could be very different. So we found out, we think we had about, 348 or something running at the time. We had 22 code enforcement calls from 2012 to 2016, so pretty minimal. Phone calls about them, and our code enforcement is, they don't go out and actively look for problems. We do depend on our citizens to call in things that they feel are, not complying with code. And so we went ahead and did a lot of research, really wanted to present to them different sides of the coin. So, what some of the complaints were, so a lot of, parking nuisance, people not knowing where to put trash, taking away from the neighborhood character, the typical case studies that we looked at, and so we did surrounding suburbs in Denver metro area. We looked at Denver because they had such a robust but also simple process that they went through, and we liked that model a lot. And then looked at other, just compared, mountain communities. We're not a mountain community. Lakewood is not a tourist destination, but it's more so people who want to age in place, and we do have some hospitals, maybe opening it up to people who want to rent out to folks who need a place to stay while their loved ones in the hospital and things like that. So we really wanted to outline that, yes, there's definitely concerns, but there's also benefits to, potentially a larger population. And a part of that discussion was really kind of pulling back from looking at just allowing it in larger lot, single-family residential areas. Because the thought was maybe those folks who can afford a large lot, large single-family home wouldn't be the ones that would really benefit, or be the only ones to benefit from, a secondary income. And so we really wanted to sort of follow Denver's kind of blanket. If it's your primary residence, you would have the opportunity to look at that. So staff's recommendation after some of the research was, let me back up a little bit. So when I say staff, I'm in the planning department, so I kind of took the lead on the research initially, so looking at different communities and different case studies, looking at the pros and cons and just presenting it in a very, mutual way, not really giving any recommendations, just informational. I engaged with our licensing, our finance department, which is our licensing department, our city clerk, who also does some of the licensing, and then our city attorney, obviously. And so we all worked in our economic development department because they work closely with the hotels and the other accommodation industry folks, and we wanted to make sure that we understood sort of what their expectations were as well, and that we weren't, because we do have a number of hotels in Lakewood, and we didn't want to cause conflict there either. So we wanted to really make sure that we were taking into account all of the stakeholders we could, and so we did that internally with that group. And so I just kind of, organized the group, and we presented to council, and then they decided after kind of hearing the informational session that they wanted us to move forward with sort of drafting recommendations, but before we did that, they wanted us to put together a survey because they wanted to hear more from their constituents. So we presented or put out a survey in June and July of 2018. It took a while to get the study session, so it just, things came up and there's a lot of other pressing issues in Lakewood. So from 2017 was the first time we presented, and then, was it 2017? no, it's 2018 when we put out the survey. Nope, it was 2017, sorry. And so we put out the survey, we collected that information, presented it again, and then 2018, it just kind of, it kind of fell off the agenda. But we had collected quite a bit of information, and it got put on to city council's, like a first hearing and then a second hearing. And during the second hearing, because of things that have come up, there's a housing some of the folks on the council are putting together a housing sort of group, and they're going to discuss this as a part of the housing. So we kind of went from, we really want to start understanding this and pushing it forward if that's the right thing to do, to kind of pulling back a little bit. But I can tell you that a lot of the public comment concerns in Lakewood were neighborhood character. Parking is a huge one. People don't like, even though it's public right-of-way, people have a really hard time when strange vehicles are parked in front of their home, even though that's not their roadway. It feels that way to a lot of folks. And so parking, making sure that parking was on site. We really leaned into the primary residence. We have a primary residence definition based due to the medical marijuana policies that we have in place. So we're utilizing that definition. We're trying to utilize a lot of the infrastructure and things and definitions that we have in place already, so we weren't recreating the wheel. So we have a household definition, so we wanted to make sure that anyone that was doing a short-term rental, they didn't fit 15 people and unrelated people into a house that really could only accommodate a family, maybe of 15, because you can't regulate the size of a family, but unrelated individuals you can certainly regulate, although difficult. And so parking, nuisances, so trash collection. I mean, how do these people take care of the place and not be loud and obnoxious for their neighbors? Let's see, and not restricting it to people that may not, opening it up to anyone, making it kind of equal opportunity, because everyone, may have an option. We heard a lot from, or may have a desire to stay in wherever they are located, whether they're renting, if it's their primary residence, and I think it's a 6-month definition with a couple of different ways to prove that in Lakewood at this point. We wanted to really make sure that it was something that everyone would have an opportunity to do, understanding that we probably have about 300 to 600 running at any given time, where our population is just about 160,000. So it's a pretty small segment of the population. We believe that most of the population that are running them don't know it's not allowed. It's not really stated. It's not really stated anywhere it's not in your face, and it's hard to find. And so we recognize that. So whether, depending on how council moves forward, I think we're going to want to clarify that in one way or another. But putting regulations in place would at least give us some ability to kind of go out and enforce and make sure people are running them appropriately and not causing a ruckus. And like I said, we haven't had a ton of phone calls on them. We do have a limited code enforcement staff, and so all of the recommendations we had put in front of council was really, things that we thought were enforceable. With the case studies that we read, putting a night limitation on, that's just really difficult to follow up with and kind of prove. But there is some third-party organizations that we would definitely need to utilize in order to kind of get a rundown of who's operating. So we can send out notifications if we end up adopting policy in the next couple of years. We want to make sure we notify them, make the licensing process easy, at least for the, and affordable for the first year, to get people to come in and want to participate and get the information they need to run it appropriately and, not interrupt the neighborhoods. We've also had a lot of HOAs kind of come up and say, well, we don't want them. So if Lakewood allows them, it's going to feel like people can do it, when they're in our HOA. And HOAs are typically more restrictive, and so that would be up to them to enforce. And code enforcement doesn't enforce HOA regulations, so I can see kind of where there might be some frustration there, but it's something that right now we don't enforce. Someone paints their house the wrong color, so it is an added item for them to communicate. But we've communicated we'd be happy to send out information and notification when the short-term rental were to come in. That was something that I also came up a number of times with our residents, and it's split. Some people are like, I don't want to know. They're supposed to operate quietly. We just kind of, we don't want neighbors to be pinning neighbors against neighbors because all of a sudden they're operating and they don't want them to. So that was another factor that we haven't worked out yet, and we're gathering more information. Council is taking more questions and sort of presenting some more information at their meeting. So I don't have a wrap up and how it ended for us, but to be continued and to be determined.
So I have a clarifying question. I read your licensing ordinance that was before council, and I was surprised that the fee was so low, and there is no, Denver, I'm sure, makes a lot of money because of the taxes that you collect on these types of land uses. You haven't considered any sort of taxing mechanism, just a licensing mechanism at this point?
They would be subject to accommodation tax on top of the licensing. So every year they would report and they would have to pay accommodation tax just the same as hotels. So that's sort of where we're looking at the taxation. But for the licensing, like I said, at least for, if it's a 1 year, we don't know if it's going to end up being an annual renewal. We're not sure how the council's going to want to roll this out. But the thought was to get people involved and aware and to get them in so they can provide the information we need, and we can communicate with folks. That's really it. We want to be transparent. We want to communicate. We want to help where we can. So we want to make the process easy and legible and affordable for folks. We really don't, the goal is to not make money off of the licensing, but at least to pay for the staff time that's going to take to work those licenses.
One more follow-up question, and then I'll turn it to the audience. Have you thought about, and I know Glenwood Springs does this for accessory dwelling units, so Glenwood Springs has a huge issue with a lot of illegal units over many, many years. And so when they passed their ADU ordinance, they basically had sort of a period where if I had, quote, illegal ADU, I could come in, bring it up to code, and then everybody was on the same page. Have any of you considered that for the short-term rentals in terms of, okay, I have a short-term rental, there's one in the NPO district here in Englewood that apparently is being operated by in one of those investment companies. But again, the idea would be if people had illegal or pre-existing short-term rentals, that somehow to get them into the system, they'd have to bring it up to code, which is in everybody's best interest if you think about health, safety, and welfare. Have any of you considered that when you passed or thinking about passing these ordinances?
I would say that the simple answer is no. They are allowed everywhere in Denver, under the primary resident condition, et cetera. But if you were operating one not as a primary resident, what you would have to do to bring that into compliance would be to have a primary resident there as its operator. There would be no way to just grandfather in just because of it.
Okay, good. Question back here?
Yes, so actually that's a good point that I want to segue off of. So with regards to the ordinance in Denver, let's talk. For ADUs or any accessory dwelling units, you obviously have code that you have to meet. Is there anything in the ordinance from a code perspective with regards to requirements for short-term rentals? Is there ADA, anything like that that's in your ordinance?
The zoning code just they would have the same rules as your house or your condo. There's some additional stuff in licensing about like fire extinguishers and stuff.
So we have some stuff specifically in the short-term rental ordinance about fire extinguishers, carbon monoxide detectors, things like that. Short-term rentals in Denver falls under Chapter 33. Our general licensing section is Chapter 32, and we can take disciplinary action on a license that is not fulfilling the zoning requirements, if that makes sense. So,
sure.
And I would add this, and I hope I don't get in trouble for this one. We've gotten a couple complaints lately about some issues, people renting out their basements without an egress window. And the idea came up that maybe we should start inspecting short-term rentals to make sure they're up to building codes and zoning codes. And when the number came up, we had to reconsider. I mean, right now we're at 2,700 licenses. So, and that's besides the 3,400 that are on the market right now that I'm trying to bring down to match those numbers. So, I mean, in the next 6 months, it could be 3,000 inspections that would.
So tied to that, from a liability standpoint, are there any insurance requirements that you're placing?
Yes. So we have a $1 million liability policy. You have to have $1 million liability. You can get that through pretty much all the major platforms right now are offering $1 million, just standard. Or you can, what we'd heard about 2 years ago was most major insurance companies, if they found out you were short-term renting, which would be a commercial enterprise, they'd cut you off. Most of them have accepted short-term rentals, and it's that evolution of everything. And some insurance companies just offer riders. So, a cheap $60 a year rider that says I'm doing short-term rentals and things like that. But yes, we require $1 million, and we require you to sign an affidavit that you have that and that you've informed, even if you're using Airbnb and you have $1 million covered, we still require you to notify your insurance company in case they want to cancel you, or in case you need to go looking for other insurance. And what she was saying, we also require an affidavit saying that you have notified your HOA in case they need to get involved prior to licensing, hopefully. But also if, an HOA has different concerns, they may have a clubhouse that's worth $2 million. So they may put it on their residents, you need more insurance. But from Denver's perspective, it was about protecting, not only the host, but our visitors and our neighbors, the neighbors that are in that neighborhood. And so we settled on $1 million, and we've kind of hit both bases with that either you have it through your homeowners or you have it through the platform, and you notify your homeowners that you're doing this just in case you do get dropped.
Okay, the woman in the polka dot shirt, and then Kate in front of her.
Hi, my name is Helen Driscoll. I'm an Englewood resident. My apologies for being late. I got started. So, anyway, having said that, am I to understand that you have systems in place, but then you mentioned that you had issues with people renting out their basements, but you're not able to follow up on those systems that you have in place. So my question is, how do you monitor that? How do you take care of that? Is it a question of how many times we have to report drunken parties next door, or how many times we have to get into a fight and our neighbor threatening to get his gun? I mean, how do you monitor that?
So I think you kind of hit on two different things there. One was kind of like the basement issue. Like if there was a basement issue, we can send out building, and we are doing that. If it's not safe to be in, it's not safe to be in, and we're not going to let you have a license, or we're going to revoke your license. The other one, I would say, and I don't mean to make it sound kind of willy-nilly, but so the complaint comes to me, and if it was a complaint about a loud party, my first step may be to call the licensee and say, I'm starting to get complaints. You need to button this up, or you get one or two more, I'm coming after your license. And in Denver, it's big money. People are making a lot of money off of this, so they're not really willing to lose their license. So I've had 20, 30 places that on their ads, it's 15 people, great for family reunions or great for bachelor parties. And if they get 2 or 3 complaints, I give them a call and I say, you're kind of skating the edge here. and I'm thinking about taking action on your license, why don't you change your ad, cut it down to 8 people, and say no parties on there? And 99% of the time that's done. Because like I said, it's a business, and they can still make money at 8 people with no parties. On the other side of that, if somebody said, I'm going to get a gun, we're going to do something. I'm going to go out there and take statements, and that was what I touched on at the beginning. We didn't have a lot of rules for houses. We had rules for businesses. And then on April 10th, I would say that violates the health, safety, and welfare of the neighborhood. And so now you're subject to that rule, and I have a very clear rule that I can enforce against you.
This was a situation where they were partying in the middle of the night. The neighbor got up and said, you know, this is a residential area. We have people who are trying to sleep at 3 o'clock. And it was in the middle of the street, and the drunken guy punched him in the face. And just punched him. Several calls went into the police, and he has a concealed carry. But he called the police on his way to his house and said, you better get here now.
Right.
So why, even with the police coming there, why did they not consider that a threat to the neighborhood?
Was that in Denver?
No, it was in Englewood.
Okay.
Right, so I think it's really important to understand what Denver has done in terms of regulating this land use. As Abe said, the heavy lifting, I mean, the planning department got the first ordinance written, but they sent it over to excise and licensing, and you've got a guy here that understands the law, understands the police, understands from the system's perspective how it sort of all works together. But they're really regulating at the front end so that as an Airbnb, if I were going to do an Airbnb, if I have to sign this affidavit, I mean, this is a very clever thing to do because I don't want to perjure myself as somebody that is renting out either my entire house or my room or whatever. So let's move along to Kate and then Sam.
Yeah,
No,
first.
Kate first.
Two quick ones.
Okay.
One for Aaron, one for Brian. Aaron, with your draft regulations, were ADUs included in that? And are multi-family apartment units also included?
Yes. So we stuck with primary residence. So if there's 2 ways to look at ADUs. We were sort of taking the view of if someone has a long-term lease. So if you had a single-family home and then an ADU, and I lived in the ADU, and you gave me permission to short-term rent it out while I was in the mountains or whatnot, Lakewood only allows ADUs to have 1 bedroom, so I should probably clarify that. So they're limited to 700 square feet in size and you can only have 1 bedroom. So that somewhat limits, how many people you can bring in anyway. So as long as there's a long-term lease, what we recommended was if it's someone's primary residence and if they're renting and the owner says it's okay for them to do a short-term rental, then they would actually be able to do it in the ADU, as well as if the owner, that's their primary residence in like larger single-family home, they could also run an Airbnb if they wanted to because that's their primary residence. If they were just utilizing the ADU for Airbnb, we wouldn't allow it in the primary residence as well. So there's 2 different ways to look at it. I do believe council may restrict that a little bit more. They may not, but we're not quite sure where they're going to land on that because ADUs were recently included into the zoning ordinance as well. And I should state too, short-term rentals isn't going to be a named use in the Lakewood zoning ordinance at this point. It's going to be a municipal code amendment rather than a named use. The use would just kind of fall within the single family or the residence. So we don't have a clear direction on that, although there may be some additional regulation on the ADU just based on some of the conversations I've heard council having.
Sam?
Yeah, I have a question and then I'd like to follow up with a comment. For cities with existing regulations in place, how is the tax revenue used? I've heard a couple of things that it's supposed to go back into neighborhoods for facilities and services. And then I heard that to pay for that, so how do you use it?
It goes into the general fund.
Yeah.
And in Denver, that's the only thing we're allowed to do. And so we had a lot of interest leading up to the regulations and like, well, this is great, you're going to have so much money, you can do the most amazing enforcement. The money can't be directed that way. So we may be earning a lot of money off of it, but Brian's not getting it.
I tell my boss every day I've collected my salary in fines. So I was awash. Like, can I get somebody else? You know,
But it keeps us honest in a way because
Right.
we can't create these systems in order to pay ourselves specifically these.
Okay, follow-up comment?
Yeah, I want to give my comment. Most of the tone here has been that short-term rentals are negative. You know, there's parking problems, there's brawls and parties. So I have an ADU behind my primary residence that I rent on Airbnb. It's 2 blocks from Swedish Hospital. 90% of my guests are patients at the hospital or visiting family members or that are terminally ill or having a procedure. The nearest decent hotels are 15 minutes away at my ADU. So it provides a very valuable service. And a lot of the other guests are coming to visit family. So I think there needs to be a recognition that it provides a valuable, low-cost service.
And I think I said that at the start. I'm pretty sure I said that when short-term rentals are done correctly, they're a great thing. When they're done wrong, they ruin neighborhoods. And to follow what you asked her, in my experience, ADUs are generally small. There's generally somebody living in the house that they're renting the ADU. So they also don't want 12 people or partying until 3 in the morning and all that other stuff. So for me, when I see somebody renting an ADU, it's like fantastic. Somebody responsible for that house is at least in the same parcel and are at least going to be responsible to their neighbors. So for me, when I see ADUs, that's kind of way far down on my radar of problems.
So real quickly, to piggyback off of the tax piece of this, right? So Brian, what kind of impact have you seen from a resource perspective in your department? What, can you quantify what it's taking you guys, or do you want to quantify that?
No. That's out of my realm of responsibilities.
And I recently rewrote the vacation rental ordinance in Manitou Springs. And they, basically short-term rentals. And the good news is that I work closely with the one code enforcement officer who, it's a town of 5,000, but there's obviously a big tourist population. I learned so much from code enforcement, so when I sort of redid the ordinance, added more things about health, safety, and welfare, and then ran into the issue that from a planning perspective, the definition of family can get you in a lawsuit so quickly right now, you would not believe it. So if you are one of the jurisdictions that defines family, I suggest you change it yesterday, because Chicago has gone down, a lot of the northern Chicago suburbs, I think, San Antonio, a number of California communities. So you can no longer, and I put together this sort of chart of sort of where people were, and I see that a lot of these jurisdictions are defining family. So if you get into the short-term rental business, you got to think about family, you got to think about the ADUs, and I think that what Denver shows is that by putting it in the licensing part of the city, they're heading things off at the beginning rather than after the complaints come in. So I think that's just should be noted. I'm going to turn it over to Eric, who is the Englewood person, And he is the project manager for the short-term rental policy discussions. So again, Englewood does not have any regulations now in the books. They're looking at it, and I think it's important to note that earlier this year, they did pass an ADU ordinance for most of the city.
Yeah, hello. So so I guess I don't have a whole lot, because since Englewood is in the process of developing draft regulations for short-term rentals at the moment, basically I'm just going to take a quick moment and talk about where we're at in the process, what to expect next in the process, and kind of what we have, the bridges that we've crossed so far in the past. So we've been looking at and researching other community short-term rentals for quite a few years now. We've had several discussions with the Planning and Zoning Commission as well as the City Attorney's Office. And through this process, we've kind of developed a draft set of regulations that we're kind of pretty comfortable with right now. So what we have seen in Englewood in the past 5 years is definitely an increase in the amount of short-term rentals and actually the activity in itself of short-term renting something. And on any given day, if you take a look at any of the turnkey Airbnb bookings, so on and so forth, you can plus minus about 100 STRs that are actually taking place in Englewood any given day. And so we are definitely trying to get something in place to help better the city monitor the short-term rentals and have some sort of recourse should there be issues that arise. Yeah, the biggest impact that we've seen as well has been comments based around the Swedish Medical Center and the lack of any hotels in Englewood and the lack of generally any hotels near the medical center at all. So a lot of the comments that we've received were this could be a potential boon for the community to provide this short, week stays in an area that is close to Swedish or in a way that's much more accessible to get to Swedish. That's the main impact we see, because obviously Englewood doesn't have the tourist numbers that you see up in the mountains. So we did hold, this is our second kind of public outreach in regards to short-term rentals. We had an open house in fall of 2018, where we basically fielded questions and took questions, and we actually had a survey as well that we had on the website, and we distributed at the open house for people to fill out and give us their comments, give us their ideas, and what they kind of wanted to see with the short-term rental regulations. And so we had taken the information that we had received and continued to draft our regulations. And so where we're at now is, one, we felt that, yeah, it would be a great idea to bring in some other cities that have had kind of gone through the brain damage of what we're going through, passing short-term rental regulations. So just to get their ideas and thoughts and make it kind of a learning experience for planning staff on what to expect and what are some of the challenges and opportunities here. So after this evening, what we are going to do is kind of have a brief discussion with the Planning and Zoning Commission at the next hearing, which is April 16th. And at that point, discuss if there is going to be any more potential changes to the draft regulations, if there's anything else that we'd like to see in the draft regulations, and at that point move forward to a public hearing with the Planning and Zoning Commission regarding the draft regulations. At that point, the public process would go to the Planning and Zoning Commission would make some recommendation to City Council. Then the City Council would move forward and schedule a public hearing. And then they would have subsequently a first reading and then subsequently a second hearing on the regulations before anything is approved. So I did want to make you aware that there will be 2 more public hearings, one at Planning and Zoning Commission and one before City Council moving forward. And, yeah, basically, that's,
Okay, clarifying questions, the woman in the...
You are aware that like sites like Airbnb and VRBO are legally obligated to divulge the addresses of all their sites in your city to city officials, right?
I was not aware of that.
No, you can't get it. If you need the address, they can't give it to you.
Perfect.
It's on their website.
That's great. Go ahead.
So I hear the comments about the need for places for visitors to stay while they have a family member, say in Craig or Swedish Hospital. I live across the street from an apartment house, and they always have at least one apartment empty. And I see that as I drive around, that these apartment houses aren't filled. Are there any regulations currently in Englewood that would not allow the apartment houses to use at least one of their apartments as an Airbnb or short-term rental, whatever you want to call it?
Right, so that's a good question. So right now, the current regs don't allow for basically any sort of accommodation in residential zoning districts throughout the city.
No, this would be an MUR3B.
So in the no, so that would actually not be allowed in that district.
Even though those
So-
apartments are able, well, I think you guys should look at that.
So I
because-
guess I would like to clarify that. So if the apartments are being used as a short-term rental, then it would not be allowed. But just a regular apartment rental, that's fine. So sorry if I misspoke there.
And you can,
And some,
I believe Greenwood Village, who does not at this point in time have a short-term rental regulation, they have some interesting regulations regarding long-term rentals that a number of cities have looked at in terms of sort of getting at the whole rental market in a different way, but they have not yet regulated it. Go ahead.
can I add to that a minute? So, for instance, our church owns a house, and they have that house set up so people can ask to stay in it when they come from out of state to be able to visit their family members. So could that not be something that you guys look at if an apartment house wants to come forward and say, I'd like to dedicate one apartment to being used as a short-term rental for people in that situation?
I don't know if you on the spot, so there are municipalities that write in exceptions to their rental regulations that deal with not-for-profits, charities, religious institutions, etc. Where that falls within the code differs greatly from municipality to municipality.
Thank you. I have two parts. One is, and I appreciate this gentleman who lives in his house when he rents it out. However, do you have anything in place right now to require the owner to live on the property, live in the property or in the house when they rent it out? Or, I mean, the one next to us, he lives in Washington State, Milton, Washington State.
So technically, right now, short-term rentals aren't allowed anywhere in the city.
Okay. Second, on your proposed regulations, are they available to whoever would like to see them? And if so, how?
Yeah, so they won't be available yet, but they will be available online once planning and zoning schedules the public hearing. And then they'll be online for everybody to read through and have a copy of the draft.
Okay. And then we'll be able to respond with the meetings that you're...
Yep, with the public hearing.
Can I add on that? What proof of residency are you requiring?
So just as a caveat, everything is in draft format right now, just to put that out there. So what I'm stating now could change 13 times before we hit the final regulation.
Why don't we just for now hold on the Englewood regulations? You had a question here, and then we'll take a break.
Well, I was just going to say, just had a comment about what you said. I think that one thing to be wary of when you're thinking of maybe we could rent out to people in these certain situations as fair housing. You can't say, oh, we'll help this guy out because
Right.
they have someone in the hospital, but not this one who wants part. You can't really do that. So it's not ideal, but unfortunately, that's the law,
Yeah.
so.
Okay, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back. I just want to introduce Wade Burkholder, who is the person that if you're here from the American Planning Association and want AICP credits, you need to sign up with Wade. The other thing, we'll take a break now, but if any of you, so 2 ways to ask questions when we come back, and we'll come back at, let's say, 20 of 8. If you don't want to be recognized as the person asking the question, feel free to write your question on an index card, and I will ask the question for you. But we'll come back, and then it'll be a dialogue and all of these.
The operator lives there, and but was only permitted in certain places, and we needed this new thing. So one of the key differentiating features between the two is that the traditional bed and breakfast can be multiple contracts at completely separate parties, can also host special events, but not a short-term rental. You have some enforcement challenges with that.
I do,
right?
Yeah.
The other way to look at that, and this is what I did when we just updated Energy Spring, and having worked closely with the code enforcement officer, is that we added a provision that it needed to meet the International Building Fire Code, and then if your municipality happens, with the whole international series of codes, there's also a property maintenance code that you can adopt. And those two things really, the problem in Manitou Springs is similar maybe to the problem you have in Denver, where all of a sudden you have way too many people residing in one unit, even if it's a home. And most people don't realize that the lots in Manitou Springs are smaller than the smallest lot in Denver. They're tiny, and so the parking is an issue, but it's really that health, safety, and welfare. The other thing that you want to consider is, do you want to have rules about things being, say, sanitized, i.e. running the dishwasher? So, that's something that, hotels and motels and other lodging needs to do. I don't know, do you guys in Englewood allow bed and breakfast?
Yeah.
You do. So sometimes you can look to bed and breakfast in terms of what those rules are, in terms of what they need to do from a health, safety, and welfare perspective. Kate?
The question for Denver and Lakewood in terms of the safety inspection or checklist or whatever that process is, or draft process might be. So do you have a process then where someone just comes in and signs an affidavit to say, I have fire extinguishers, carbon monoxide detectors, egress windows, whatever it is, and then you go off that affidavit, or is there another layer to that?
That's our only layer.
Okay.
But like I said, we briefly, and we're having discussions about going out and inspecting. Building wants to do it, we have to figure out a way to do it sensibly, I think.
Kathleen?
I was delighted to hear Brian say that at one point you started realizing that inspections, especially with egress windows and basins, would be a good idea, but you were overwhelmed at over 2,000 properties to deal with. But I wanted to make sure that Eric and our group heard that, because we only have, as you were saying, 100 that you are aware of. And that poses a very manageable, very doable inspection option to get a hold of those. You know, every time, like your city does, in Clear Creek, when you're initiating the license, you go in at least that first time and inspect, so that you do have a safety inspection to make sure that the egress windows do exist, or the other things that are required to exist. You don't have to do it annually, but you at least do it once.
Kathleen, can you speak up or I can give you?
Oh, I think I'm not.
I can't hear you back here.
Oh, okay. I was asking, I was very pleased that Brian from Denver mentioned his interest in considering doing inspections when he did hear that people were doing short-term rentals in basements without egress windows, but the existing 2,000 or more was prohibitive on starting that immediately, but you are considering it. I am trying to take a lead from that to our city that has no intention of doing inspections right now, but following other leads where you just do the affidavit, and if there happens to be a fire or something, then they deal with it afterwards. I am trying to ask, now that you know that an experienced city is regretting that, or considering that, considering that, or concerned about that, I would like to know, I have two questions tonight, two on opposite directions, but I would like to know that we would reverse the affidavit and take advantage of knowing that it is important to Denver that's doing this and has been doing this, and go ahead and initiate inspections as a requirement, at least as an initial one. Because each of those 100, if you do make this legal, each of those 100 that exist are going to have to get licensed. And then each consecutive time that they get licensed, you can send someone out. And then we don't have to worry about that. My question on the complete opposite end is, as everyone knows, I'm against STRs, short-term rentals in Englewood at all. If by chance they are denied by our city, what will Englewood do to put more teeth? Right now they are illegal, but we've never done anything about that. And there's some people who are quite miserable in some blocks as a result of the STRs that do exist in their neighborhood. If we were to say no to an STR, what would Englewood do to put teeth in the laws that already exist that they aren't doing anything with right now to stop them? Right now you only have supposedly 100 to stop.
So I'm going to actually punt that question. Since I can't speak for code enforcement, I can't speak to any discussions that we've had regarding any sort of changes to the regulation. They just haven't been discussed. So that just might be a bridge we'll have to cross when we come to it.
And maybe the question that you need to ask City of Englewood residents is, are you better off? So we have Morrison here, the chair of the Morrison Planning Commission, and Jamie, you have said no to short-term rentals. She's here tonight because the issue is enforcement. So the question really is, if you say no, enforcement is really tough. And I've heard in another meeting I facilitated for the city that code enforcement is just a tough thing because you're always sort of 3 steps behind. Doesn't matter what municipality you're in. So some people think, well, if we regulate STRs, and maybe if we have an amnesty program where you ask people that have existing ones, and then they have to upgrade to meet health, safety, welfare, that they have the egress windows in the basement, that they're code compliant, electrical, fire, et cetera, that you don't have too many people there. I think that's the choice a municipality needs to make. are we better off saying no and trying to get tough, which is what Morrison is facing right now, or are we better regulating and then really going after the health, safety, welfare, and have a system in place where we can put some teeth in to ensure. I mean, my biggest worry for Englewood is if there are already people in the city that are investment owners that are cherry picking homes in Englewood, you know, what can the city do about that? There's nothing that they can do right now in the zoning ordinance, so how are they going to regulate ownership and who can have and who cannot have? Because you're totally open on that. Every community is totally open. Jamie, have you had experience with that in Morrison?
Yes, we have.
Okay, I'm going to just ask Jamie, because I know her and I know Morrison, to just sort of talk about what they've experienced. Because they've decided not to regulate or to say no.
Yeah, we did a 2-year study as well to try to figure out what we wanted to regulate and how we could regulate it. And of course, Morrison really is an effective population of 300 people. 175 of them live in the nursing home. That's not short-term. That's short-term rentals in a different, direction. But it's true that we, as neighbors to one another, we know who is doing this illegally. And now we have no way to go after it and prevent it because we didn't allow it at all. So how do you say you can't do this now? It's a strange kind of a gray area. You got any ideas?
Yes, so I think there are two clever things that happened in Denver. And Abe was mentioning one of them to me to mention here. Our ordinance says it's illegal to advertise a short-term rental without a license. So if they can't advertise, then in theory they can't get renters. The other clever thing we did is if you are licensed, you have to put your license number on your ad. So therefore, anything that's out there, there's software companies and we use host compliance. As soon as they identify an ad with an address, I either know they don't have a license or I can look on their ad and when they have something fishy listed, there's kind of a multi-pronged approach to that, right? So you can't have an advertisement without a license, so I can immediately take action on that. I can take action immediately if you don't put your license number on there. So that's, I think, kind of where your enforcement would get some teeth is if you could get that passed, is that you can't advertise without a license, which you're never going to issue.
And then a follow-up on that, which is a community choice, is I agree with Brian, you have to have the license number on any advertising, okay? The question then becomes, do you think that if I own a short-term rental, I should have some sort of placard somewhere on my front facade that lists my license number? That's a debate a number of communities have had.
May I suggest that you go through Airbnb, since Morrison is so small, and look for anything that's advertised?
Well, that's only one. There are many different sites that do short-term rentals.
Absolutely.
And so we have a staff of 3. There's not going to be a lot of people who are going to sit there and call through all of the Airbnb and the VRBO and the bookings
and right now
it goes.
Booking.com has more short-term rentals than Airbnb. So again, it's a changing market, and Ryan and I could have a long discussion about whether or not host compliance is a good way to go. I had a lot of issue with host compliance in terms of what they would look for and what they wouldn't look for, and even with a small staff, felt that our one code enforcement officer had a better handle on what was going on with the short-term rentals, licensed or non-licensed, rather than post-compliance, because tell them how big they are.
The host compliance?
Yes.
I think, I want to say they're monitoring over 90 websites. They're nationwide. I think they have contracts with 250 cities. I would dare to say that, in the last, I don't know when your last interaction with them was, but in the last 3 years, they've professionalized. I mean, there is no possible way I could do my job without host compliance.
Right, but the issue that you need to know about as this industry and sharing economy evolves, okay, people are looking at different venues to advertise their short-term rental. So when I pushed post-compliance, because we ran into this in Manitou Springs, I mean, it's a major destination with Pikes Peak and the now closed but a lot of the advertising for these rentals was not done through the major companies, but rather in the local papers. And I asked them specifically, do you look at the Pikes Peak Bulletin? No. They do not go down to that local level. So if you're a small community with limited staff, do you want to pay, is it $5,000 a month? Is that what they charge? I think. Does anyone know?
It depends on the size of the community.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a charge, an extra service that you're looking at. And so I think the other question you need to ask yourself is host compliance the best way to do it? If I were Denver and I was that big, I would say we have no other choice. But I don't know about the smaller communities.
A couple of questions. So with regards to the growth that Denver, you have seen in Airbnbs or short-term rentals, you're mentioning somewhere around 2,600 that you're aware of today, right? Or that you have licensed, is that correct?
Licensed. We have 3,566 that are currently advertised.
Okay, so when you started this officially, what was the number at that point, and at what date?
I could get you exact numbers for exact dates, but we'd gone down to 2,000 licenses and 4,400 listings. So we went below 50% before I took the job.
Okay.
So I just had, in the agenda, I had some figures. So if you look at the metro area, the metro area not defined, at that point in time, the dominant platform was Airbnb. So they had 1,700 listings in 2014. And as of December 2018, they had 8,300. That's one platform.
Right, that's the metro area.
Yes.
So with regards to that also, before, and this is Denver and Lakewood today, before you enacted your ordinances and regulatory processes or policies, how or were you guys, or is it Lakewood today with the 300 to 600 that you believe are out there, are you doing any kind of enforcement, or did Denver do any kind of enforcement against those illegal short-term rentals?
So we were enforcing by complaint only before the adoption of the new regulations. We weren't proactive about it. One of the challenges with that, and this kind of goes back to Morrison and the choices moving forward in the future, is that the complaints, I think sometimes they were against very bad operators. Sometimes they were, I don't like my neighbor, and they're conducting a short-term rental, and it's all illegal, and so it was like the same violation either way, basically. And we also had no ability to enforce based on advertising alone, because our zoning isn't set up that way. That came in with the licensing. So with the new system, allowed us to get a more realistic handle on things by legitimizing the ones that were the relatively good operators and concentrating heightened enforcement on the bad actors. And in terms of the numbers, I mean, my memory is that what we were tracking prior to the adoption of the ordinance is almost as many advertised short-term rentals as you're seeing now. The numbers went way down after adoption of the ordinance and the new requirements came in. You've got to have the licensing number in there and things like that. And they've just now returned to that peak.
And I can give you a website that has all of our numbers. We do it every 3 months. We calculate our numbers and where we're at, and I'll show you that website before we go.
Can I chime in real quick before you move on? So I just wanted to let you know that Lakewood is also reactive, so if someone calls in or code enforcement goes out, they do, due diligence to kind of look through the websites. Most of the time people are pretty honest, they give them a timeline to shut down. But we have heard from folks that if policy was in place, there would be some written consequences for people to actually see. So it would give them a little bit more guidelines and just more understanding that, if this happens, this is what the consequences are, rather than, telling on your neighbor or doing something like, if someone were to call planning right now and ask, well, what if I get caught? I would just say a really nice code enforcement officer would probably come out there and ask you to shut it down. And then if they continue to follow up on it and you're not shutting it down, they can take legal action. But there's no written sort of penalty. And so we've heard a lot from some of the folks that it would be really nice to see what the penalty is. And Denver has some large number of fees, per day, right? Is that still in place?
Well, I mean, we can do per day. It turns out to be, generally I write a letter saying you're doing something wrong, wait about 2 weeks and then start fining them.
Yeah, and those numbers though have an impact on people who typically don't want to lose their ability to do it. But so they're not allowed in Lakewood. We do give them time, but we have heard a number of people wanting regulate, even if people don't want to do them themselves or they would never participate in them, they would still like to see some regulation. That's one part of our segment of population. Other people don't want them in either. So just wanted to put that out there. Go ahead.
Okay, this is for Brian Snow. He had a question for me, and I just wanted to answer it for you, the address thing. I think we both got a little confused after that. What my point was that if Englewood currently has really no clue how many are operating right now, couldn't they go to the sites who are legally obligated to help city officials, as it says? Yes, it does. It totally does. I read it. I swear. Anyway. Can't they just go to these sites and say, can you please give us a number of how many you have?
They will absolutely refuse to share any information whatsoever.
Because don't they want to be good neighbors?
No, they do not. In fact, probably 60% of Airbnb's income from the city of Denver comes from illegal short-term rentals.
That was my second question, the thing about the licensing. Didn't that come and bite you on the ass like really hard because they all started sharing the licenses?
No, so you have to put your license number on your ad.
Right, but I was reading in the paper that you had a problem because there were a lot of illegal short-term rentals that were using other people's license numbers on their.
Yeah, I can't imagine that being an issue, and I haven't. I have one case right now where I've seen it, but what host compliance will do is so they have an advertisement, they will identify the house and put an address on it. So they'll say 100 Broadway. They'll capture whatever license number is on there, and then when we send our licensing information to host compliance, they compare the two, and it's not licensed. We don't run our compliance system based off of what a host tells us their license number is. We run our compliance system based on, I know your address, and there's no license issued to that address. I don't care what number you put on your ad. So if you've put an actual valid license number from somebody else, that's just going to add to my charges.
Okay, then what happens to the person who shared their number?
They may not have shared
They may not have shared it.
That's how you get it from the bus.
Yeah, you could get it from anywhere.
Okay. It's,
Yeah. I mean, all of our numbers have the same format, so all of our license numbers have the same format, so you can make up anything, and it doesn't matter. I'm doing it based off your address.
Okay, I have convinced this lovely citizen from the city of Littleton, he lives in Littleton, he's a longtime resident, and if you've read in the paper, Littleton went through, what, 2 years, 3 years?
No, it was shorter than that.
Okay, but they looked at short-term rentals and decided not to enact anything. And so Dan is simply a interested citizen that is trying to create better community dialogue about this. So I thought he could just share what they've been going through. It took some convincing for him to do this.
So in the city of Littleton, basically, the conversation started around the house that was across the street from me. And it was one of those where it was, the people had remodeled the home. It's a beautiful home, sleeps 17, great for events, things like that. So we got ridiculous stuff happening. And the interpretation at the time of the code was that it was an accessory use, just like Denver. However, they said basically using it as a primary use, like you're renting the whole house, is considered an accessory use. So that was the current interpretation of the law at the time. So we went through the process of trying to convince council to do something. They put a moratorium in place for 6 months, which then got extended to 9 months. And after that, they went through an entire thing. They were going to go with a primary residency and 8 months of owner occupancy. And they were trying to overhaul a few different things at the same time as well. They were putting in definitions for like bed and breakfast, big motels. There's a lot of things going on with it. It was a pretty thick, wordy ordinance, which is probably one of the reasons why it failed, because it was very thick and very wordy and very just onerous to read to a certain degree. So the ordinance ended up, we had, on the second public hearing, I think there were 44 people to do public comment that night. And you know, it ended up failing on, I think it was a 4-3 vote. And since that time, a group of us have gotten together to sort of go to, there's 4 sort of neighbors who had bad experiences and 4 people who own Airbnbs. We've gotten together to sort of try and hammer something out as far as what we should do with this, because it's pretty clear that we're not going to get primary residence approved. I can't really talk about, I guess, anything besides that. But that's what's happened in our city. I would heavily encourage Englewood to pass something, and just to not to have something there. But you know, it's definitely been an uphill battle the whole way. The primary residency seems to be where this entire area is going to me. It kind of surprised me that they couldn't get that passed through in Littleton, but that's their prerogative. It's the city, and they're trying to do what's best for their city. So that's where we stand right now. We're trying to. There's a group of citizens that are trying to come up with something that we can hopefully present to our city council and get something solved. So.
A lot of you may have read about the Littleton story, so I thought it might be helpful to hear it from somebody who was involved. Other questions of the panel? Go ahead, Carolyn.
At one point, Brian, did you say, did I hear you say that now you're rethinking your decision on number of days?
Yes.
And could you just talk about that a little bit more?
So right now our definition is usual place of return for housing. So I would say every time I take enforcement action, they say define usual. And I say regularly, customary, predictable, you know, I just read it off of Google. And they'll find one of the words that said, you know, customarily. Well, I customarily come there every other month. You know, so we won our case, our one case, which gave me a lot of confidence. But I think there's some tightening up to do.
And I don't know what that tightening up is without days. You know, is it, do you spend 50% of your time there? Do you, you know, I don't know what it is. And I'm not speaking on behalf of the city, by the way. This is just me saying, I'm writing all these reports and saying, man, I wish I had a number of days.
Is there anything else that you, as you go through this, you're thinking, man, I wish we put this definition in place?
No, I think, I was telling somebody earlier, I think Denver is probably one of the most developed programs in the country in terms of the licensing, the ease of licensing, bringing people into the system, taking complaints, taking actions on those complaints. And our last step is getting rid of bad operators. And April 10th, our new rules come into effect. So I think from top to bottom, we've gotten the idea right of primary residency, where it's allowed, how we handle complaints, and now our last step is those bad operators and getting them out of the system. So I think from top to bottom, we've done a really good job, and we're at a refinement stage at this point.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we benefited from not overthinking it, so to speak. And in a way, that's one of the reasons we don't have the number of days, is because what is the number of days? Like, we didn't know. So we went with simplicity, what we think we can enforce. Other cities that we talked to, Portland, other places, had much more complicated requirements involving square footages and numbers of bedrooms and numbers of nights and inspections, and all of those things may be very good things, but we didn't know how to successfully manage all of that, and so we didn't adopt it. And now we can think about how to build
2
up
years
the
of
right
experience,
tools, I think.
and saying, this is the case that I have, and this is how I prove it.
Okay.
And so,
Kate and then Kathleen.
Just had a quick procedural question, if you know how this might go. So you have the zoning land use side and having it as a permitted or permitted limited use in the code, and then you have your compliance side. So if you decide to change the definition of primary residence, is that within your office, or does that have to go back through your planning?
Well, yeah, I think you could probably change your definition without a change to the zoning code, hopefully, because changing the zoning code is not simple. Because you'd be basically building a more specific definition onto something that's more broad.
For a license or something.
you're used to just residence.
Yeah, I mean, the zoning code does say that the primary resident must be the person who conducts the short-term rental, but you know what, it actually refers, it says the definition of primary residence shall be the definition set forth in the municipal code. So when you change it there, you thought of something in advance.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Kathleen?
I was just going to ask Brian if you would kindly talk a little bit again about your thoughts on inspections in hindsight and going forward, safety, an actual safety inspection.
So again, I would start out with the values things that I talked about first. What are the values that we want in our city for short-term rentals? And one of them is safety of our tourists. And that is, whenever we look at licensing something in our department, we say, what role do we have to play in that? Like, we're not going to license, something that doesn't affect anybody's health or safety or anything. So, yes, I think we should, and I probably think it'll be more complaint-based, because we are starting to get that as the program is developed and the complaints come in, and I get a call that says, and I've probably done it 10, 12, 15 times, where somebody will take some pictures of a basement and say, open rafters and spiders everywhere and all this other stuff, and I'll send out the zoning team. So we had, I wouldn't say an informal process, but we already had that in place. It's, do we want to expand on that from more of a complaint-based to getting out there more, or, you know, I dare to say, do we ask in the application, are you renting out a basement? Do you have egress windows and make them certify that, or are you renting out a basement and those are the ones we go and check if that's our major safety concern? I don't know what that looks like yet, but I mean, it's been within the last 2 or 3 weeks that the building department's come to us and said, I think we have a role to play in this. So it's
a
at
tough
a
one,
very
though,
initial
because
stage.
a lot of people live in those basements full-time too. I mean, I live in a bedroom that's
And the argument was
really unsafe, probably.
Right. The argument was made that that's your house, and you decided to live in that unsafe basement.
Right.
But now
I
you've
did
turned it
disagree.
into, yeah, now you've turned it into a commercial use, and those people may not have agreed with that. So,
If he wants to risk his own life, that's fine.
right, exactly, that's the conversation we had.
Someone pays to come in and not know that they're risking their own.
Right.
Yes. Maureen, you had a question?
I recently spoke to a woman who uses it, she and her husband use Airbnbs, and in California, they rented, and there was actually an evaluation they could do of the Airbnb, and in return, the owner could rate them as users of Airbnbs, and other people could access that information to decide, was that a place I'd want to rent? Or do I
That's-
want to rent to these people?
That's standard on pretty much every
Oh, so
website.
you see that?
Yeah. And so hopefully, you know, if you're renting a bad place, the market force will take care of itself. So.
You're not taking action against bad reviews?
No.
So, I'm going to, back to Manitou Springs, they took a very different approach. Again, big tourist town. They put in place, I'm not saying this is right, a rule that said you cannot have one Airbnb short-term rental within 500 feet of another. Because they were concerned about neighborhood impact. That if you got a heavy concentration of short-term rentals, particularly in that environment, that's, you know, basically a box end canyon with every kind of environmental hazard, you know, flooding, wildfire, and geological hazards. So how they ever built that, you know, if we had today's rules, nothing would be there. But putting that aside, they had the 500-foot rule. And then when I got there, I asked the question, well, what is this 21 days? So it basically says if I have an Airbnb, I have to rent it for at least 21 days per year. Now, why did they do that? Because they limited the number based on the 500-foot rule. They didn't want people taking up those limited licenses by not really renting it. So it's sort of a very different approach. One, I think, that is worth considering just because it helps you think a little bit differently about how this works. I mean, the biggest issue we had is certain people saying, well, I'm over 500 feet if you measure it from my door. So we had to make it very clear that it was from the property line. So again, I think Denver, you chose to make it simple, and there's a reason why when you get into this, that you keep it simple.
Equity primarily on that
Yes,
one.
yeah. So, you know, lots of consideration. And I think in all of these communities, I mean, everyone, even if they don't have them, it's basically, you know, a 2-year study of what does this mean for my community And back to, I think what Denver has said, is what are the values? You know, what are we trying to protect? Everybody wants to manage change in their own neighborhood. And so again, the question is, what is the best route for us to go where we can have some sort of stability in the neighborhood that we live in? Sam?
In that rule, where you limit it to 500 feet, how do you decide who gets the Airbnb license and who doesn't?
So they did it on a sort of first come, first served basis. So a lot of people, and again, that is such a small community with such small lots where they don't have enough parking in a neighborhood as it is. So they've had to institute sort of these residential teeny parking lots. So even if I'm a full-time resident, I have a place to park. So again, lots of challenges, and no one has challenged them on that, which is also an interesting question. Other? Judy?
A question to Eric. Do you live in Englewood?
No, I do not.
I'm kind of new to the topic. How long have you been working on this project?
It was one of the first projects I got assigned when I first started working here, a little over a year ago. So, and even at that point, there had been some initial research done by the planner before me. So, it's STR research has been well underway since 2017.
Since when?
2017.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Go ahead, Carolyn.
For you.
What?
For you.
No, well, sort of for all of you. So it strikes me that we're looking at how to regulate good behavior.
That's what I keep saying to everybody. I say that at least twice a day to people. I can't regulate civility. The primary residency thing works 99% of the time.
That's a good thing. So, but I wanted to know how much in your planning, so the policy planning, how much did you include the compliance people and the building people in that for input when you were doing your policy?
We, quite a bit, like it was a cross-departmental effort. Planning and excise and licensing were really the leads. Then we had building officials and others. The building officials do tend to be pretty conservative, and they would have been really happy for us just to, find a way to cut it off. But yeah, they did this.
So we would be wise to do
And
that.
from our end, like I was saying earlier, we didn't have a lot of rules around kind of that civility factor. And so April 10th is when our rules take effect, and that's that health, safety, and welfare. So I think we'll be on a great road, for what I call the bad actors. So.
Jamie?
I think being in such a small community, what I'm listening for is ease of administration. Because that is something that in anything we do, in any ordinance, in anything that we take on in Warren, that's the first thing we have to think of. How is this going to be enforced? Who is going to enforce it? Who's going to have to be that guy? And go knock on your neighbor's door, because everybody knows everybody in a town that small, and you are the face of the person who's making the complaint. And so that is really where it gets right down to it is, how do you enforce this?
And I think that the one thing to remember is it's not one size fits all. So, I mean, the good thing about Denver is they have lots of departments and lots of staff. And so if they were going to enforce this, I mean, you've got your building department, you've got your zoning enforcement, you've got Brian and his board. I mean, in Manitou Springs, we had post compliance.
Yeah, a a contractor who did.
Right,
code compliance.
which, when city council looks at the budget, well, why are we paying for, we just lost, $500,000 when the cog, shut down, so why are we paying for this? But I think that in Manitou's case, we had, I'm not there anymore, but had a really good, he's still there, code compliance officer. And he was the one that really dealt with the neighborhood complaints. He would come and say, Carolyn, you called. He would be there, very personable, sort of knew the building code, knew the fire code. That city has its own fire department, so we could call in one of the fire guys to also look at the place. Because again, in that community, because it's so tightly packed in, the impact was not only noise, parking, the sort of normal complaints, disasters are frequent in that community. You just need to listen to the news. And so I think it's a whole different, again, so I think what works for Denver may not work for Englewood, may not work for Lakewood. All of these communities are in different places. I think it's really important that the decision makers, your planning commission, your city council, but also the citizens understand what the choices are. Because there are choices along the way that you need to make. And again, most municipalities that we work with are always short-staffed.
Well, I'm also making a pitch for the KISS system.
Yes.
Keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the bottom line for most of us.
Yeah, so.
So,
Helen,
what you're
you
saying
can
is,
detail.
I know, I didn't want to be the lady in the puppet what you were saying, I do kind of have a question about what you were saying about how Lakewood is different than Englewood, Denver is different from Englewood, Manitowoc Springs is different from Englewood. So then I have to ask, why are we here? Why aren't we having this discussion with Englewood people and talking about the problems in Englewood? Because we have all of these issues that are happening in Denver and Lakewood and Manitowoc Springs and everywhere else. But we're not discussing Englewood. And that's where we need to be discussing, where the discussion needs to be. So I guess I'm confused as to why this is happening.
So my understanding, but I might have to put Eric on the spot, is that this is one of many opportunities for the citizens of Englewood to learn about short-term rentals from other people. This was also a way, you have a lot of American Institute of Certified Planners that are here from other places because they need their credits. So it served two purposes. But I think the good news, if you live in Englewood, that you get to hear different perspectives from different communities. I mean, I know Dan is here from Wheatridge. They're looking at it. You're Brian?
Brighton.
Brighton. No, what's your name?
Oh, Mike from Brighton.
Mike. So I know, I can't read your tag. So I know Brighton is also in the same place. We have two people from Jefferson County. They have one now. Yeah. But they have regulations now, and they're looking at how to tweak them. I mean, I think you have to remember that this is such an evolving, fast-growing industry, and that's why I thought reading the article on the shared economy would be helpful for everyone, because right now we're talking about residential homes. You know, the next thing is going to be offices. There's also something about what is curb space worth in a sharing economy. Okay, because there's so many things that have to stop to deliver, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that I think, and many people, and I've told a couple people, but I think it's going to shake up the real estate industry like nothing we've seen since 2004 when Zillow first came about. So the person that founded Zillow left in 2010. He has now rejoined the company in 2019 because Zillow is going to get into the real estate market. What does that mean? It means that they will be advertising, okay, you want to sell your home, but you don't want people going through your closets, you don't want to do the open houses, you don't want to do any of this. Zillow will come in and buy your property for what they think is the fair market value because they've been fine-tuning this Zestimate. Not quite sure how they're going to do it, but it's going to mean an incredible amount of liquidity in the real estate market. So it's just something to keep your eye on, because if you have lived in your house, I lived in my house for 30 years, so I know some of you have lived in your house for a long time, is things, no matter what you do, are going to change because the way in which the sharing economy is blossoming in ways that we never, ever anticipate. I mean, the article from the Wharton School basically says, you know, who are going to be the people that are going to be using the short-term rentals? Business travelers and the millennials. Those are the two next growth segments, but there's a lot more behind that that I think is going to turn, you know, I mean, Brian hasn't, he's 100. So, Kate?
I just wanted to add on to that. I just Googled it, and Airbnb is worth at least $38 billion, so that's what we're up against, whether we will have to pass something, because they're going to be in our neighborhoods maybe no matter what.
Yeah. But again, I think that maybe the question to ask yourself, only because I know one, is are people targeting Englewood because you don't have regulations, and therefore it's becoming attractive for these investment groups that are targeting places that don't have the regulations because they can fly under the radar. What do you guys think?
I think in terms of inviting all of us here, like, I understand what you're saying about speaking to Englewood only, but I would recommend looking around first at what cities are successful and what they're doing. So, you know, I haven't seen any draft proposals from you guys, but like the thing I mentioned about the advertising, making that illegal, that's our linchpin of enforcement. If you can't advertise, you're not going to be short-term rental. Putting your license number on the thing. What lessons did we learn about having that simple code and not having kind of the teeth to go after bad actors? All of those things you now kind of have available at your disposal to look at a place like Denver and say, you know, these are the things that they're being successful with. And we're smaller, and we may have kind of different rules about it, about who can rent and how many houses and some other things. But in order for enforcement to be effective, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from Denver, and, you know, LA is, I think I did 4 hours with 4 city attorneys from LA the other day about how it works and what staff is needed and things like that. So
regulation and enforcement, whether you do have regulation, I mean, you do have systems in place or you don't, it seems like regulation and enforcement is a key factor. And it seems that that's not, I mean, follow through is what's important. So you have these systems in place, however, you're not, it's difficult, okay, at best to monitor or follow up on the regulations that you have in place. So, and the same with, you don't have it, you can't have, you're saying they can't have the numbers. But also,
I realize that your system may look a whole lot different, and, you know, with 300 or 600 or 1,000 short-term rentals, it's gonna look completely different than Denver. But what would be a failure, I think, for Englewood at this point, you know, having so many resources to draw on, is to not have teeth for bad actors, right? To kind of pass that first law that just, you know, when we started, it was, let's make this as simple as possible, the application as simple as possible, the application fee is $25. And then over time, we've learned these lessons that a person who's having parties every weekend, we didn't have a lot of tools to take care of that unless, you know, we could really get the police involved. So for you guys, even though your model a little different and smaller and the numbers and everything will look different, I think there's some really valuable lessons from what we've done in Denver about, like I said, like advertising, making that a priority, making the license number on your ads a priority, making methods to discipline licensees that are acting poorly, you know, to have that right up front from the start.
But if we have, I mean, the house next to us, we've had several complaints, we've called the police up, nothing's been done about it. So
Right, but that's what I'm saying is that
what's going to change when you have regulations and they're still, I mean, they have broken the law and still nothing has been done.
But that's what I'm saying, that's the point of licensing, right? Is that if they want to run a short-term
I don't
rental.
agree, sir. Just because you have a license does not mean they're not going to be bad actors. We have plenty of laws on the books to take care of it now, but it's not being enforced. If the police would go out and stop these people from their noise and their sanitation and their illegal activities and the 3 o'clock in the morning noise and trash going everywhere and cars and beatings and prostitution, we could solve it.
Right.
It has nothing to do with whether it's an Airbnb or not, because people can do it and you'll never know about it if they're doing it right.
Right.
The more regulations you have, the more opportunities there are for somebody to skirt those licenses. And we'll just waste money. If we can't enforce what we've got now, it's not going to happen with more regulation.
Any last questions? Wade?
Brian, just clarify if you could how many staff members you have that are in your team?
I have 6 inspectors, but the investigations are on me. So that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the points I think you heard made is that if you get into any of this, you really need to look at what staff is required to ensure. I mean, your point exactly, it's fine to have a regulation on the books, but if you don't have any follow-through, then people are just going to windshield wiper, this is the windshield wiper, they're just going to ignore it. So, I mean, I think that maybe a next step for Englewood would be to sit down with the police, sit down with code enforcement and planning, and maybe have a sort of joint sort of powwow in terms of whatever direction you're going in, how are you going to handle this? So.
I know it's getting late, but I have to respond to what you're saying. The problems that you're experiencing at that house are related to short-term rentals, right?
No, it's not. I have a problem similar to hers, but it had nothing to do with short-term rentals. And all the people said was, oh, they're relatives. I don't believe anybody has 150 relatives that are homeless and drug addicts. But they were cycling in and out, and I put up with it for 5 years because the police would not do anything. If we cannot enforce the rules that are on the books now, there's no amount of regulation relating to the Airbnbs that are going to solve it.
I thought you were saying the house next door that had all those problems.
No, they're all over the place, but it's not just somebody that pretends it's an Airbnb. That just because he's calling it an Airbnb doesn't make it one. It's a party house, it's a house of prostitution. I had the same thing, and they didn't call it an Airbnb. It was a homeless shelter. And the police wouldn't do anything about it. And there must have been 50 people in that house at any one time. And they were hopping fences and drug.
So do I want you to respond as a past police person?
No.
Okay.
The point that she's trying to make, and we're trying to make, is that we don't have any regulations right now. But, however, we cannot get something done that's against the law, that, I mean, the complaints that we've had over and over again, nothing is being done. So what is going to happen? We're going to have more regulations where nothing's going to get done. And that's what I'm seeing. It's like, it's just saying, okay, here you go, we have regulations now, and.
But again, if you don't.
There's no follow-through.
Yeah, if you don't have the follow-through, I mean, I always have a rule when I go into communities, it's sort of like, I don't care what's on the books, but if you're not enforcing it, then get rid of it, okay? And this gets back to keep it simple, because some of these codes are getting so incredibly long, and then there's amendment after amendment after amendment, and nobody knows sort of, what the rules are. And then with the advent of the web, now we have these things that, like I looked in Lakewood, it was very interesting to see where you were on the web with your short-term rentals. And I think the system was like on a holiday because it kept on spinning. But I finally found one place where it showed the community dialogue, but I could not tell what the status of that ordinance was on licensing. So again, I've done this for 40 years. I should be able to, look at it. But if you're a citizen, think how long it will take. So again, make sure that what you have on your books, you can enforce. Otherwise, people then don't trust the system, and people then start believing that they can trick the system. One guy does it, talks to his friend, next guy does it. So again, make sure that what you have on your books, you can enforce, so you don't have citizens that are unhappy. So, any last comments? Jen, you've been around a lot. Jen's the new planning director for Littleton.
Well, and I would say in regards to your comments about why are we listening to these other things, I think you can kind of take the sharing economy a step further, and we're sharing information and learning from each other. And I'm one for, especially the communities of Littleton and Sheridan and Englewood, we're so closely intertwined, both geographically and demographically. I think we have a lot to learn from each other.
Sure, my front lawn's parking lot, apparently, so, thanks.
So one last.
I'd just really like to thank the panel for sharing your.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Wheat Ridge.
Thank you, Wheat Ridge.
You're welcome.
Right.